How's it going, theater freaks? Welcome to my channel. Today I just have one question. Why is everybody obsessed with this Hamilton? Written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote and starred in The Heights in 2008, started working on this musical as early as 2004. It's the story of the founding fathers from the perspective of Hamilton, but the cast is more diverse ethnically than obviously it was in real life. In Miranda's words, it is, quote, America then as told by America now. It completely sold out both off-Broadway and on-Broadway, broke and holds the record for most Tony nominations, although doesn't quite hold the record for Tony wins, as the producer still has that. Still, the acclaim was undeniable. It got uniformly positive reviews. Teenagers all over the internet are obsessed with it, and why is this? If you were like me, you might have actually been hesitant to the musical, not because of anything from the musical itself, but because of the fan base being so strong. Sometimes massive fan bases can just intimidate and scare you and make you feel like you're gonna become dead if you admit you haven't seen a musical, so then you become even more turned off to a musical. But anyway, this video's here to dispel that. Let's put all that aside and let's just talk about the show itself, the piece of art that was made by Lin-Manuel Miranda, and discover why people were so obsessed with this musical. Does it live up to the hype? Okay, yeah, but let's talk about why. Now, there have been other musicals that have done very well at Tonys, but why does Hamilton in particular connect so well with people, especially young people? Were musicals like Fun Home, or Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder, or The Book of Mormon, which also won Best Musical, just don't quite connect on that same universal level. If you're a theater freak, you probably get giddy when I mention those because they're great shows, but there's something about Hamilton that appealed to people who don't usually care about musical theater. And why was that? Well, on the optics themselves, I think there are two major reasons why. First of all, the style of the music is more familiar to people who aren't usually into musical theater. It's fun to sing along with. You know, a musical like Fun Home or Gentleman's Guide, these musicals, while you watch them and you cry or you laugh and you respect the merit of the musical, it may not connect with you as much as Hamilton does. It's more fun, it's more personal, it's more something that sticks with you as you walk out the theater. So the style of music is something that's different and fresh, but also the second major reason is that the story itself is just more relatable. It's got the easiest hook ever. I mean, think about when you write a story or even a movie, how difficult it can be to attract an audience when they don't know anything about your character and your story. So you have to do these previews and trailers and interviews to try and introduce people to the concept of the characters. In a sense, Miranda is lucky here that everyone knows who Hamilton is and we all are interested in the story of the founding fathers. So when you take that and mix it with a style of music that most people love, you have a brilliant concept that before you even see or hear anything from the show, you're instantly fascinated by it. I mean, even my dad liked it, and he's the last person to be into modern hip-hop style of art. So while those things are great, those were advantages that Lin-Manuel had as far as getting people, to come see the show. But if that's all he had and the musical itself was subpar, it would not have taken off as well as it did. But it wasn't, and it did. So why exactly? So while the musical takes a very familiar story we're all aware of the founding fathers and talking about Hamilton, Jefferson, Washington, and all their stories and how they all connect, what's beautiful about Hamilton is that it puts character to the grand story. I talked about this a little bit in my Les Miserables video, which I'll put up there, which was another musical that was about a big historical event, but it brought the personal elements to it, reminding us that there are actual people just like you and me in these grand stories that we read about in history books. And that's exactly what Miranda did with Hamilton. Now, let's get into some of those characters. Now, it's kind of impossible to just dissect the character of Hamilton and how he's portrayed in this musical without showing his relationship to other characters and juxtaposing their journeys and their choices and their character arcs. And the main juxtaposition in this story is one between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. So what are their character arcs and how are they similar and different at the same time? Now, Hamilton and Burr both had very tortured pasts. They're both orphans, although Hamilton became an orphan much later in life than Burr did. Both Burr's parents and his grandparents died before he was 3 years old, and he was taken in by his abusive uncle who was younger than I am. He was 21 or so. But Burr remembered the dying wishes of his parents, which was for him to go to college and to do as well as he could and to kind of stick with the system and trust that he'll find the dignity he deserves. His parents were follow the treaded path kind of people, and that way of thinking was burned into him. Hamilton became an orphan when he was 13, when his mother died of yellow fever, but for Alexander, he didn't feel like he had really any support, so he relied on books and learning as his way of pushing through his misery and finding the legacy that he wants. He wanted to be a part of something, and he eventually found that by working hard and getting on a ship to America, and his journey is about being a self-starter, as is one of the lyrics in the show, and about taking control, taking every opportunity he has, and that it's on him. No one's gonna make his reality happen for him. It's going to be his doing. That's the mentality he has burnt into him from his upbringing, as he had no choice but to do that. And those two ways of thinking are shown back to back throughout the entire musical. Again, Burr relies on the system, he waits his turn, he bides his time, and Alexander takes control and does everything he can to seize the moment. And both of them have their successes and their failures from those ways of thinking. Another thing that's important is that Burr, in believing he has to stick with the system, is afraid of showing anything from inside. He thinks everything has to come from external sources, and his job is to simply wait and get carried by the universe, and it will give him the power that he wants. Hamilton does not rely on things going his way, and he feels like he has to manipulate and control things in order to get what he wants. Now, Aaron Burr is one of the first people who Alexander met as far as politics was concerned, and Burr introduces him to Hercules Mulligan, John Laurens, and Lafayette. So Burr really took Alexander under his wing, and he tries to teach him the way that he learns things, which is to keep your cards close to your chest at all times and never tell people what your true intentions are. And pretty immediately, Alexander's like, no, that's not how I do things. So Hamilton goes up the ranks pretty quickly, and Burr watches Alexander get a lot of the things that he wants. He becomes Washington's aide. He gets invited to the Constitutional Convention. He becomes the Secretary of Treasury. And most importantly, he gets to make influential, powerful decisions and be in the room where it happens with the Compromise of 1790, which of course is the compromise that Hamilton makes with Jefferson and Madison, where the federal government will take responsibility for the state debts, and in return the South gets the capital. So Burr watches Alexander do everything that is against Burr's principles, and was getting everything that Burr wanted. And Burr was watching that tortured throughout the whole musical. And then when he finally gets the opportunity he's wanted so badly to become president, it all falls to Hamilton's say. It's one of the most powerful endorsements of presidential election history. And Aaron Burr believes he deserves it. He took Alexander under his wing. He pretty much is the person who started him on his whole journey to get to where he is. And he believes this is it. I'm gonna reap what I sow. And when he doesn't, when he realizes that he loses to the person who Hamilton disagrees with completely in Jefferson, but loses because he chose not to have principles, that's when he realizes that he needs to figure out how to be almost more impulsive and more rash and just do what he actually wants and show his true colors. So he challenges Hamilton to a duel, and before I talk about the significance of what happens, let's go over where Alexander has been this whole time. So he flies the ranks. He becomes Washington's aide because of his boldness, both on the field and in his writing. He writes 51 essays for the Federalist Papers. He gets invited to the Constitutional Convention. He becomes the Secretary of Treasury, but Alexander's journey is a little more personal. See, having to take control and not wanting to wait at all also has its harms. It's not like Aaron Burr is just the villain and he goes through all the problems from his choices, and then Alexander is the hero and he gets all the good things from his choices. It's not that black and white. Not when you have a playwright as intelligent as Lin-Manuel Miranda. So for instance, Aaron Burr is in love with Theodosia, who's married to a British soldier, but he waits to make any kind of move or, do the love thing because he knows it would hurt him massively. And on that same note, Hamilton doesn't wait. He can't wait to go home to Eliza, so he ends up cheating on her with Maria Reynolds. Now this ends up biting him in the butt because her husband is able to use that to extort him and blackmail him for money, and then eventually he has to release the Reynolds pamphlets and tell his wife and the whole world that he's been cheating on her. And then after his son Philip's death, he ends up going back to Eliza and staying with her and surrendering his legacy and telling her that if you'll just listen to me, that'll be enough. And that alone is a character moment for him where he's surrendering his legacy. And then after he endorses Jefferson for president, he gets challenged to a duel by Burr, and in the duel is where we have the massive character moment by both Burr and Hamilton. Burr has spent the entire musical waiting and waiting. Hamilton has spent the entire show taking every opportunity he has, seizing the moment and not throwing away his shot. But what does he do in the duel? He throws away his shot, and Aaron Burr shoots too soon and screams wait, as if talking to himself, wishing he had waited to see that Hamilton was shooting in the air. So both characters do the opposite thing that they had been doing throughout the story. So the one time Burr finally does it and acts on impulse. Ultimately the show is about what is a legacy. Is a legacy about being in the room where it happens, having that power, having that influence, or is it about planting seeds for trees that you'll never live to see? And Hamilton comes to that realization. He gives up his shot and it kills him, but it's better for his overall legacy, even though he ended up sacrificing his life. Aaron Burr lived his whole life power hungry, and it got him to have a legacy in history, but a negative one. And his story shows what happens when you live your life personally, trying to build your own selfish legacy. You end up getting the opposite of what you wanted. Gosh, there is so much depth just to that Burr-Hamilton relationship. I kind of want to release a video in the future just talking about that. I've already talked way too long about it. I'm going to move on. And another relationship that really changes Hamilton is his relationship with George Washington. Now, Washington is a very very level-headed, patient, wise man. He's portrayed as kind of the father figure in the story, but he wasn't always like that. He used to be like Hamilton. He sees Hamilton as a son. It's not so subtly pointed out because he keeps calling him son, but he sees himself in him particularly because he had some of his old flaws. He's reckless, he's rash, and Washington was also very hasty. He led his troops into a slaughterhouse when he had his first command, and that moment changed him forever and made him realize that acting on impulse and trying to be in the moment and take the opportunity isn't always the right thing in the long run. And seeing Hamilton as his younger self, he sees how Hamilton could grow and learn to control himself and become like him. And when Washington decides not to run for president and not keep power as long as he can, so as to set a precedent for the future and a legacy, this changes Hamilton, and this affects his decision later on to give up his shot so as to preserve his legacy in the long run in the duel with Burr. And the last relationship I really want to talk about is his relationship with Eliza and Angelica. Now, historically, it's kind of ambiguous as to whether or not Angelica really did love Hamilton, but it's strongly hinted at. There's a letter that she wrote to Eliza in 1794 where she says, "Your husband, I love him very much, and if you are as generous as the old Romans, you would lend him to me for a while." Now, it was likely a joke between sisters, but Miranda decides to kind of capitalize on this and consider the possibility that Angelica actually did love Hamilton. And it's interesting whether or not it's actually true. And I mean, one other thing I didn't mention is that this musical is amazingly accurate, so if it wants to take liberties every now and then, it kind of deserves the right to. Now, Eliza and Angelica also have a contrast. Eliza's very selfless. She's not quite as confident as Angelica is. Angelica's kind of like Hamilton in a lot of ways. She's very bold. She takes opportunities when she sees them. Eliza's kind of waiting in the back. She doesn't really trust herself. So this is evident of when she meets Hamilton. Rather than approaching Hamilton, she relies on Angelica to go and approach him. And she fully believes that Hamilton's going to fall in love with Angelica. And he could have, but Angelica makes the choice that's kind of antithetical to her impulses as well, which is that she decides to introduce him to Eliza. She chose not to take her shot of having Hamilton for herself and introduces him to her sister. And while this is very difficult for her, she knows it will lead to the happiness of Eliza, and it does. And she never really finds love on her own, but she devotes the rest of her life to Eliza staying by her side. And Eliza is very grateful for this. She's thankful that her father gives it his blessing, and she's very content. That's her character trait. She's very content. She's okay with what is enough. She doesn't need a legacy. She doesn't need money. And Hamilton, who needs a legacy and who needs all this stuff, quite selfishly, I mean, like I said, Hamilton isn't just the hero and Aaron Burr's the villain and everything Hamilton does is right. No, of course not. He cheats on his wife. So after his selfish act, she ends up burning the letters because she realizes those letters were really just selfishly more for him than they were for her. So she gives up the legacy. She doesn't want historians to know what her reaction was. And after her son died and Hamilton comes back to her and basically confides in her that he's given up any need for a legacy, any need for power, and has devoted the rest of his life to just being by her side, then she has her own character moment. She forgives him. She then decides to put herself back into the narrative and continue his legacy. She carries the torch of his legacy through interviews, the Washington Monument, speaking out against slavery, and of course creating the first private orphanage in New York City. But the legacy is from a selfless place. She's fighting for somebody else's legacy. And that is the way, again, I'm saying legacy a lot, but that's the best way to actually build one, is to do it from a selfless place. So waiting isn't all bad. Taking every opportunity isn't all bad. They're not all good either. They both have flaws. The problem is sometimes we stick to a way of living that isn't always the right thing to do. What we need to do is be willing to be malleable and change how we live based on what's right in the moment. So if we have a tendency to be very impulsive and acting out of emotion, we may need to back up and learn how to be more patient and waiting. If you have a tendency of waiting for the opportunity and not acting when you should, sometimes you need to learn to push yourself into that. You kind of need a balance in life. But at the end of the day, it's all about being selfless, about thinking about what's going to outlive you. And I mean, King George is a perfect example of that. He absolutely has no care about anything beyond his own life. He has a great legacy when he's alive. People worship him basically. But then after he dies and generations later, we look back at those kings as evil monarchs. So I feel like that's really the message of Hamilton. And I think those kind of messages resonate on a deep level, where whether you're a 7-year-old girl who just kind of loves the music and you sing along in the car ride home after you've seen the musical, or you're a really distinguished critic and you really look at this stuff really analytically, or if you're kind of somewhere between like me, you'll find appreciation for the musical. Now, there are other characters I could get into as well. They weren't quite as fleshed out, but I do like how they were portrayed as well. Hercules Mulligan, John Laurens, and Lafayette, they're portrayed as kind of like frat boys. It's just a reminder that these people, these founding fathers we look up to, were very young when the revolution was was happening. Jefferson, we could get into him a little bit. He's cocky, he's resentful of the fact that Washington takes Hamilton's side. He's definitely selfish, but he's very bold about what he believes, and that's ultimately why Hamilton chooses him. Just the production, the direction, the brilliant performances. I mean, 4 of the actors were nominated for Tonys, 3 of them won. Actually, no, I'm wrong. 5 were nominated, and 3 of them won. It's really when the story works so well, and when so much attention goes into it, that a musical really just becomes Hamilton. It becomes the massive legend that it is. It's deserved. There's so much more I could have talked about. I could have made a video 10 hours long and I would have just scratched the surface of how much depth and woven intricacies are in this story. But I did my best. I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate you guys for watching. Click like if you did enjoy it. Leave a comment if you agree or disagree with something I said. Go ahead and click subscribe if you enjoy these theater analysis videos. Share the video with a friend. It would help me out a lot. Thanks again for watching. Keep loving theater, and I will see you next time.